Welcome to this episode of Church Grammar. On today's episode, Madison Pierce and I talk through the incarnation and the hypostatic union. We try to work through some interpretive issues and some theological issues related to Christ's obedience, his submission, his weaknesses and frailties, some of the biblical texts that talk about this, in particular, the doctrine of hypostatic union, as we see it in different passages of Scripture. We will focus a lot on the book of Hebrews, which Madison is well acquainted with, and we just kind of talk out loud together about these different issues, maybe where we might disagree, where one of us might emphasize the divinity or the humanity over another. Maybe what does it mean to be human as Christ being human, and then what does that mean for us as humans who are trying to be like him, to follow him, and what are the distinctions between his humanity and ours, if any? So I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Madison. As always, we're brought to you by B&H Academic. Go to bhacademic.com to find out more about their latest textbooks and monographs. We're also brought to you by the Christian Standard Bible. You can go to csbible.com to find out more about that English translation. And now, my conversation with Madison Pierce. But first, no big deal. All right, Madison Pierce is back. We said we were going to do this 10 to 12 times a year, but because of your busy schedule, being a budding, famous New Testament scholar, we've had a hard time getting together. So I'm glad we finally were able to make something work.
I feel like it's actually because you write me with like 1 day's notice. You're like, I'm so busy that I just happen to find, 20 minutes in my busy schedule. Can you please drop everything you have going on and do it? And I'm like, Brian, I'm saving the world and taking care of my family. I can't possibly come and speak to you tomorrow.
That's true. Last time I tried that, you were on vacation, and then I tried again and you said, no, I told you I'm still on vacation. So that may or may not be fair. Well, let's just say this. There's truth in both. There's truth that you're a budding, amazing New Testament scholar who's getting too busy. And it's true that I lack the scheduling skills to give you enough time to make up for the fact that you are that type of scholar. Is that fair?
Well, thank you, Brandon. That's really sweet. That I always have time for church grammar.
Always have time for church grammar.
Maybe tomorrow. So,
Well, I'll give you 20 minutes notice tomorrow and see if we can do another one. All right. Well, we've done, as one reviewer on Apple Podcasts said, we've done too much gratuitous small talk here at the beginning. So I wouldn't want to go too far. Not that I care about what people say about me, Madison, because I don't.
No, of course not.
At all.
No.
No, we have shared before our course evaluations. I had a course evaluation last semester where someone said, this class would be better if you lectured like such and such, one of my colleagues. So, it was like a very positive. And then that one person said that. And then I was like, well, that person's been teaching longer than I've been alive. So I'm not sure what you want from me. So
I literally had a course evaluation one time that said I needed to get a new personality. And, there's a lot that I need to learn, but that would hurt.
Was there any follow-up, like, and maybe this is the type of personality you should have, or just get a new one?
No, I have no idea what exactly, like, you smile too much, or you make too many really terrible, like, dad/mom jokes, or like you think you're funny, or it could have been something that's actually not true. Like, I do think I'm kind of funny and I do make too many dad/mom jokes, but some of the other stuff, I don't know. So
yeah, well, that's just what comes with the territory. So I actually told one of my students, she was the perfect example, because I'm barely different from real life in class. I'm like slightly more serious in class, but not that much. And so my classes, sometimes I'll have a class where like they're on board day one, they're already laughing, they're with me, and then like we're going to have a good time.
I love it.
I have one class this semester that's taken time to get there. And I've seen it all play out, particularly in one person's face. And I told her this after class the other day. She started out with like, they're all wearing masks, so you only get the eyes. And she started out like squinting at me, like, what is he talking about? Like, why did he? And then it turned into like, she would start laughing. I could tell she was smiling and or laughing. And then now that we're about halfway or so through the semester, now it's, she just shakes her head at me like I'm her dad who's embarrassing her in public. So I really appreciated watching that trajectory of our informal professor-student relationship, as I've just seen her face. And I asked her if that was fair, and she said, yeah, pretty much. So
I love it.
So that's just my personality. I can't not be me. So
totally. Yeah. You got to be you. We actually accidentally taught my daughter the phrase, "I'm a peacock, you got to let me fly."
Oh no.
And she's been saying that a lot, so that reminds me of this.
Well, let's fly. How about it? All right, we're going to start today. So we're trying to be slightly more organized than we were before. Whether or not that's actually going to work itself out is another question, but we did at least talk about one thing we want to talk about before we started. And the whole conversation that I want to have today primarily is about how I tried to tweet something. And here's the problem. And this is what my colleague, Ched Spellman, reminds me often, that there is no way really to tweet anything on Twitter that's not just stupid. If you try to be serious at all, somebody's not going to like it. And so I tried to say that in Hebrews 9, you see an example of inseparable operations, because you see the eternal Spirit, who Christ, offers himself without blemish to God through the eternal Spirit. And of course, not of course, but I am aware that is a contested passage and idea in the book of Hebrews. Particularly, is this a heavenly offering, or is this related to the crucifixion? Nonetheless, I shot my shot and said, either way, I think that you can make the same argument there, right? And that I don't want to disconnect the crucifixion from the heavenly offering from each other too much. So in that sense, I said, hey, I think you can probably do both. And anyway, I say that, and I get a reply on Twitter, and it's from my dear friend, Madison Pierce, that just says, and I quote, no, sorry, that's not it. Where is it? Oh, I just had it.
You're mixing these up. There's two different things. So on that occasion,
you're right. Yep.
You were like,
Madison,
come to my defense. No, you didn't even give me an option on this one. You're like, Madison, insert yourself into this conversation. Back me up, y'all. And I was I don't know, Brandon.
Did I do it on this one? This is the one that I invited you into. That's correct. Yeah. And then you just basically Hebrews backslapped me, but you kind of backhanded
You're the one that brought up Hebrews this time.
So anyway, you tried to be nice, and you brought up Hebrews. The second time was I wasn't even bringing up Hebrews, and you came after me and brought up Hebrews. You're right. Give the context for the other one, because I mentioned the wrong one. You're right. This happens so often. I get them all confused.
The other one was you grossly oversimplified something, and I was like, oh, well, maybe we should add some nuance. I think that's how it went. I don't know if we need any more detail than that.
Yeah, who needs more detail? Like, just as long as it makes you look good, right? That's what we really care about here. I said something about how Christ didn't put on flesh to become like us. He put on flesh so that we might become like him, which was admittedly a gross generalization, and was admittedly a response to a definite subtweet response to not other tweets, but like things I keep hearing in class. And so I was sort of like trying to say, well, it's this too, or that you can say both. Athanasius says both at the same time. And you just dropped in Hebrews 2. I think you just said Hebrews 2. Did you say? I don't know if you added another word. 2. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think Hebrews 2. Yeah, with a question mark. To be fair, I was in Memphis. I was playing some seriously nerdy board games. I happened to pick up my phone for 5 seconds while waiting on someone whose turn was taking too long. And that was like the first tweet that I saw. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know, Brandon. So I only had a second. I thought, you can go for it. Yeah. Then I found out that was against our friend rules, and I'm really sorry.
Well, all I said was basically that I did not know you were that good at basketball, because you just dunked all over me in front of everybody. And you were like, that wasn't a dunk. So apparently you didn't understand what dunking on Twitter was, because you do it so often, right? The fact that I just confused two stories tells you everything you need to know. So, but we thought it would make a good conversation, because it would be an interesting conversation to talk about the relationship in the incarnation between what does it mean for Christ to be truly human? What does it mean for us to be humans or fallen humanity? So I thought that'd be fun to talk about. And then I guess the heavenly offering thing does relate to the thing that you want to talk about David Moffat as well. So would you like to start with you dunking on me and us talking about the incarnation, or would you like to talk about Moffat and heavenly offering in Hebrews? Because those are both there.
Well, let's start with the book a little bit, because that can be a good jumping off point to talking about some of the ways that this conversation gets oversimplified and whatever. But I did want to say that I had already picked Moffat's book whenever the first conversation happened about Hebrews 9. And so I'd already decided like this is going to be like the book that I want to read to Brandon, because it's just so important that it also has these like one sentence kind of things that like shatter your, previous conceptions and stuff. So I was super excited that it came up, but then I felt like, oh no, he's going to figure out what book I'm talking about, or what book I'm bringing.
Yeah, and a little background too is that on the last episode, I just started reading from Don Collette's book to Madison with no warning whatsoever and said, what do you think about these sentences? Which is totally unfair. But then we thought that actually would be fun to do. So it's now her turn to read me books out of context from a book that I've not read, and to get my response. So just fair warning, this is basically sheer ignorance at this point as this conversation goes along, at least on my part. So
I told Brandon that I didn't prepare sufficiently, but I was going to just read him some German footnotes and pretend like I totally expected him to like be able to respond really cogently. So I didn't do that, but mostly just because I didn't prepare.
So you got to be able to pronounce it. It's German. So you can't just be dropping German, just willy nilly. So
I guess people won't see us. So me holding up this book doesn't matter. Okay. Nope. But so what we're looking at is atonement and the logic of resurrection in the Epistle to the Hebrews by David M. Moffat. It's in the Brill Novum Testamentum supplements, or supplements to Novum Testamentum. And so this book it's super important for Hebrew scholarship, but I think it's really important for New Testament scholarship generally, because it points toward, or it's a reaction to trends in New Testament scholarship that reduce the ascension, exaltation, the resurrection of Jesus, and make the cross they center the cross, no pun intended, in a way that's unhelpful. And that really, I think does damage to our theology, but we can talk more about that. So here's some quotes, Brandon. I've set it up. Maybe I've given the game away, but here we are. Okay. So here's one. Oh, this isn't too long. All right. I'll shorten it a little. In view of the widely held assumption that Jesus' death stands at the center of the soteriology, goodness.
Just try German. Just try German. Your English
I can't even say theological terms today. Developed in Hebrews, this last statement is likely to be somewhat surprising. And that's, sorry, I skipped ahead and I skipped the antecedent for this. The writer does not identify Jesus' death as the moment of redemption and purification. That's pretty intense. Mm-hmm. And so here, is that surprising? Yeah, it's surprising. I think you've anticipated this, David Moffat. It is, however, no less surprising than the fact that the author of Hebrews himself consistently identifies the presentation of Jesus' offering in heaven as the event that effected atonement. Thoughts?
Read that last sentence again.
It is, however, no less surprising than the fact that the author of Hebrews himself consistently identifies the presentation of Jesus' offering in heaven as the event that effected atonement.
So his argument is that the atonement is not truly and finally effective until his heavenly session, basically. So it's not at the cross, it's not at the resurrection, not at the ascension or exaltation, or at least not completed until then. Is that right?
Until the heavenly offering. So the presentation of his blood in the heavenly tabernacle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think I'm on board with that, completely out of context in two sentences in this major work, as you know how this feels. I mean, I'll explain how I talk about it, at least generally, like when I teach it, for example, and then you can tell me what you think. So I don't deal with heavenly offering a lot when I teach on it. Probably because I've grossly oversimplified in the way that Moffat says. But I do try to go out of my way to explain the connection between the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, and the heavenly session. Because what I tend to find with probably most evangelicals, I found this in the church, find this in the classroom, that the cross is so centrally focused that students will often, or lay people will oftentimes completely miss all the rest of it. Not to mention the fact that Christ doesn't send the Spirit, he says himself, until all this happens. So my initial thought is yes. Although I guess I don't want to separate them into individual events per se, other than to say that you can't have any without the other, right? But where the heavenly offering, I mean, I'm trying to think where this idea appears aside from Hebrews, because, I mean, is it in some sense similar to the way that Paul talks about exaltation? He talks about his session, when Scripture talks about him interceding for us. Paul says he lives to intercede for us, these kind of things. So I guess my question back to you as the Hebrew scholar would be, I guess, in what ways would this particular, besides the fact that it's biblical, which is the most important part, but at what point does this sort of particular heavenly offering, how does that fit into that larger kind of framework of cross, resurrection, ascension, etc.?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So I think something that we may want to nuance, and that, that I will like juke and chalk up to mystery to a degree, is whether we can like actually map this all together, and whether, I mean, there is some discussion in Moffat's work as to whether this is a metaphorical image of the work of Christ, but that he's not actually like walking up to the heavenly altar.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm completely open to that. It seems like a pretty dominant perspective in early Jewish literature. We certainly see it in Revelation and Hebrews. I'm sure you could jump in here on Revelation. But what happens in Hebrews is that we, of course, have the death of Christ, which in Hebrews itself is only mentioned explicitly 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's all this discussion, especially among lay people, about how Hebrews is only about Christology. I'm, of course, trying so hard to work against that.
Mm-hmm.
It is, all things are Christology, and maybe here we're coming to inseparable operations to a degree. But the other 2 divine persons are super important in Hebrews also.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a side note. So the thing is that the cross is essential, but then the resurrection for Hebrews is what enables Jesus to be a priest in the heavenly tabernacle. It actually says that a couple of times, that it's him being perfected, which Moffat and others have argued is his obtainment of the heavenly or resurrection body that allows him to be qualified for or to be in the likeness of Melchizedek, or to be in the order of Melchizedek, or whatever, however you want to translate that.
Mm-hmm.
I prefer the prior. So he ascends and enters into the heavenly tabernacle, makes his offering, and then he sits down. And that's, of course, a crucial point in Hebrews as well. It's not necessarily that his heavenly work ceases, because we have that he always lives to intercede for us. And that's similar to what we see elsewhere, like in Paul. But he does sit down, and that is a symbol of his offering, or that the act or action of his offering being complete, but not necessarily completed. Mm-hmm. So I'll stop for a second. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So some of the metaphysical questions that are interesting to me in this discussion, one of the things that I will sometimes go off on a side rant about when I talk about this is the idea that there is a human body in the heavenly realm right now, right? And so there is a sense in which there is a physical man standing in heaven right now. Yeah. So what does that mean? We don't know entirely, but I feel like that's where this conversation can at least be somewhat helpful, is to think this is a human priest forever who has come. And so the metaphysical question is, though, that in the sort of spiritual realm, is there an actual throne per se? Or is this an analogy for the rule and reign of God? Is there an actual tabernacle for Jesus to go to, right? That's the critique. Of course, the answer is, who knows, right? Yeah. So what is it? I mean, even when we say he sits down at the right hand of the Father, that's well attested in several places. Stephen sees him at the right hand of the Father in Acts. So we know that he's at the right hand of the Father sitting at some level. Again, is that analogous? But he has a literal body. So in some sense, he is either standing, kneeling, sitting, laying, assumedly, I guess maybe floating. I don't know if he didn't have anything to lay on. But I think that's where people, I say all that to say, I think that's where people sort of get, they just take it too far, and they want to try to explain all of it. And so I think even the caveat, for me at least, the caveat of, we don't know what that actually looks like physically or metaphysically, but there is a sense in which this is part of his priestly work. And Scripture is very clear that he's a priest. Well, his priestly work is not merely, although it is, I think, but not merely the crucifixion, the idea the veil is torn, this kind of idea. I think that's a beautiful picture of the fact that he is both the priest and the sacrifice, right? That he basically is the one in the Holy of Holies who is making the sacrifice and also is the sacrifice, right? And in some sense, inseparable operations, you could say he also is accepting his own sacrifice or something like that, right? So what that looks like physically, who knows exactly? But I think that is helpful, just how you're laying that out. I think where I'd want to not go too far, and you can tell me if Moffat does this. Again, this is me speaking ignorantly out of context. I think we want to be able to say, if we're going to affirm any version of substitutionary atonement, for example, we want to be able to say that the cross and the shedding of blood is such a crucial central part to the idea of substitution. So I guess if we want to say, if Moffat is saying something like, well, atonement doesn't really happen or reach its final conclusion until the heavenly offering or something, I think I'd be fine with that. I think. But there's also a sense in which each act post-crucifixion, because I think, I'm guessing Moffat would say something like this. I know others have, which the idea is that the crucifixion is the starting point or the sort of initiation of the atonement work. So I think that's right. I guess the question would be, at what level do we start flattening out the individual? The resurrection has its own sort of giving us new life, defeating death, has its own place, right?
Yeah.
It's not mere atonement, but it's also something else. The exaltation has to do with humanity, has to do with kingly activity, stuff like that. So I guess that's where I'd say, like, how do you think through that in terms of at what level do we want to say this is all one event, which I'm happy to do. But also I don't want to say, well, atonement doesn't really happen until way over here. So I don't know, just thinking through that sort of the natural progression, but also the work in its totality. How do you think through some of that in terms of Hebrews and what Moffat says?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think, I would love to chat through this because I am coming at it from the perspective of a biblical scholar and hoping to give each writer his own kind of distinctive emphasis on or with atonement. But I want to make sure that I'm doing that in a way that's theologically responsible, of course. And so my understanding would be that, Hebrews does seem to imply that Jesus is not qualified to serve as priest until he has a resurrection body. It doesn't, so the blood he's taking into the heavenly tabernacle is still the blood that he shed on the cross. So that is a starting point. And I think that there is something where some say he's a proleptic priest. I think of it almost as like an inherited or something that he is going to be, but he actually is inaugurated or like brought into the role, but he's preparing for it ahead of time, that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily in the text. It's just trying to make sense of how this fits with the other pictures that we see. So, I think elsewhere though, like in John, in John's gospel, we clearly see that Jesus is portrayed as the Paschal Lamb. That obviously has atoning significance. And I think it is the cross that's where John imagines that taking place. So for Hebrews, that's shifted a little bit, and it's more about the offering of the blood. And I think that pushes us towards seeing all of the events as a kind of comprehensive work of atonement. But it also suggests that we need to take each of them seriously. We need to take seriously the whole, but I don't think we should collapse them, but maybe that's me being biblical scholarly and you want to push on it.
Well, that is you being a myopic biblical scholar, which is the problem with you people. Goodness. But no, there is a sense you do have to, like what Moffat seems to be doing, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what he seems to be doing is saying, what does Hebrews say about resurrection and atonement? So a critique of, well, what about Paul is not what Moffat's trying to do, first of all, right?
Yeah.
But also, there is the sense in which these all contribute uniquely to the whole. So as long as we acknowledge that we do have to look at this in light of the gospel accounts, in light of Paul, in light of James or John or whoever else. I think that's where it can get. That's where when you do the sort of what does Hebrews say, as a scholar, sometimes if we're not careful, we will say this is what it is, and it's like, no, this is what Hebrews. This is the symphony that Hebrews is singing. This is not all that it is. So I think that's where my maybe concern would come in, but that's not a critique of Moffat's work, because he's not trying to do that.
Exactly.
The question is for me is, okay, let's now when we start to step back and talk about, the theology of atonement or the theology of the work of Christ. I think about, this is not going to surprise you, but I think about a church father in this discussion. Athanasius, when he talks about the incarnation, he barely talks about the birth at all. Sometimes when we think about incarnation, we think of just the virgin birth, and he views the incarnation as the entire humanly work of Christ, right? So there is a sense in which I like thinking that way as a theologian even. And so that's where I get my theology goggles on and say, okay, what is Hebrews contributing here? And then how does that fit? So I think that's where I'm even asking that question of, when we talk about atonement per se, that might be a little bit different than saying, what does the author of Hebrews trying to say about atonement? So
I think we're on the same page, and I think Athanasius is a good example because he loves John and he loves Hebrews. So I think his theology is distinctly shaped, and John doesn't do a lot with the birth narrative either, or anything really.
Yeah, right. So. Well, and John Behr, his new book on, he's talking about this exact thing. This is basically not even the focus of the letter at all, or the gospel at all. I like how you said Athanasius, because I am so hardcore about Augustine and Irenaeus, but then I don't say Athanasius the way all of the snobs say you're supposed to, even though I'm so hardcore about the other two. So I need to get.
I say Irenaeus, actually.
Yeah. So you see, so we'll just trade off on that, because Irenaeus is correct. So
what? Okay.
Sorry.
I don't make the rules. Britishly.
I don't make the rules. I just report them. No, Irenaeus is how British people say it too.
No, I say Irenaeus.
Really? Well, John Behr's from England, and he says Irenaeus. There's one. Stephen Presley did his PhD at St. Andrews, and he says Irenaeus. So okay. Anyway, no, that's a good conversation. Do you have any other quotes from Moffat that you like that you want to throw out there?
I mean, I have a couple, but they would be some of the things that we've already talked about. They would kind of contribute to that. So, the writer's high priestly Christology depends upon Jesus's resurrection. It is only because Jesus rose from the dead, ascended into heaven, appeared before God, and presented himself alive to God, that Jesus' death can be seen retrospectively to be part of the sacrificial process. So that may be some, I don't know if you feel comfortable with that part. His death was the necessary event that set into motion the sequence that resulted in the offering that affected the full atonement he obtained.
So basically, and I say this when it comes to the resurrection, right? If Jesus died and stayed dead, it wouldn't do us any good.
Yeah.
But what Moffat wants to say is not just that he died and stayed dead, not just that he rose, not just that he ascended or was exalted, if you want to put those together or separate them. But also that he gave this heavenly offering, and that Hebrews contributes that in a way that we can't ignore that piece of it.
Yeah.
That'd be fair.
Yeah. The one further thing I'd add is you were talking about him being raised bodily, which is, of course, super important and Pauline. But that's something that Moffat's gotten a lot of pushback about is, him entering bodily and offering blood, like actual blood. So that's a secondary thing that his book has contributed, is a reminder about the importance of Jesus' humanity in Hebrews. Because again, a lot of studies are like, look at the exaltation of Jesus, hooray, a so-called high Christology, woohoo! But then you realize, my goodness, and this may also help us transition to this discussion about how important Hebrews 2 is. Jesus is clearly richly inhabiting the human experience. And so they're both there. Anyways.
No, that's good. Yeah. Well, let's transition to the other one, because that is a good transition. So the other side of it is, and this is one of my favorite discussions. So I'm happy to do this for 3 hours if you want to. Like, I love talking about it in class. I love talking about it with colleagues. I love writing about it and reading about it. Is what does it mean for the Son of God to put on flesh, right? Well, what does that actually mean? In what ways is he human like us? In which ways is he not human like us? And what does that mean? So this is the other place where you dunked on me And you were right. You were right to say that I was oversimplified. I said, he didn't put on flesh to become like us, but rather he put on flesh so that we might become like him. And that is an oversimplification. But what I was trying to sort of get across is a lot of times we sort of freight all of our humanity onto Jesus, such that Jesus has to be exactly like us in every way in order to be truly human.
Yeah.
So, for example, he has to have struggled with every temptation I've ever struggled with, or he has to have the same internal wrestling with sin that you and I do in order for his temptations to be real or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Hebrews gets into a lot of this, so it's great to talk to a Hebrews scholar about this.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I try to get across when I say that is that ultimately what he is doing is patterning true humanity. He's not just a better moralist than us. He's not just wrestling with sin like me, but a little bit better. But then I actually know, because he is God, he is impeccable. He is incapable of sin. And so that's why he has to put on flesh, because literally no other human can do that. That's the point, right? That's why every other covenant has failed, and every other person who's been a part of every covenant has failed, right? From human perspective. So that's where I want to get in and say, yes, he becomes like us, of course, in the sense that he puts on real flesh. He lives in the real world and, is inhabiting a real human body in a real fallen world and all that kind of stuff, of course. Yeah. But I think where the conversation goes from there is we start thinking, well, pimple-faced 14-year-old Jesus struggled with lust like pimple-faced 14-year-old teenager in America does. And that's where I want to start getting into that conversation of, okay, what is that? But what does it mean for him to be human when it comes to some of those kind of things? Yeah. So that's where I'm kind of coming from. So I'll kind of tell you, you can just respond to sort of my, so John Owen has this really good, it's not often you're going to hear me quote a reformer, Puritan, or post-reformer. So take them when you can, guys. But John Owen has a really helpful distinction where he talks about the difference between internal and external temptation. And so he says, with Christ, it's not that he is always internally at war with himself as though he may sin at any moment, but rather because he has put on flesh and lives in a fallen world, external temptation comes to him. The difference between us and Jesus, is that you and I are literally trying to make a decision between whether or not we're going to sin, whereas Jesus is not necessarily, at least in the sense that it's possible for him to have fallen. And so, for example, one of the examples I use with students that always like cracks them up and shocks them at the same time is I say, somebody could walk in this room right now and say, Dr. Smith, I want you to go home right now and hit your wife in the head with a hammer. And I'm just like, there's no world in which I'm not remotely tempted to go hit my wife in the head with him ever. Like, that's just, never would I do something like that. That is a temptation, but I'm not wrestling with the temptation. Right. And so I talk about Matthew 4 and Jesus and his interaction with Satan. Jesus does not seem to be whatsoever wrestling with whether or not he's going to give in to Satan's temptation. And I say that's actually the point, because what it means to be true human is what it means for us to be in the new creation. Right. And in the new creation, there is no more sin. There is no more tears. We're not going to sin anymore. We're not going to sin. Right. And the difference between us in the future and Adam and Eve is that because we are tied to Jesus's perfect obedience and we're tied to Jesus's perfect righteousness, the only way we could fall is if he falls, and he never will. That's the difference. That's why he's the better Adam, the second Adam. So that's where I get into that and say, he didn't become like us in every possible respect when it comes to he is like us fallen humans. No, actually, he is the true humanity by which we are sort of patterning after. So we're trying to be like him in his humanity, not him trying to be like us. So there's my little mini rant. You tell me what you think.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are 3 places in Hebrews where this is addressed. Yep. I think like more robustly. So, of course, Hebrews 2 would be one where he, shares blood and flesh so that he can be made like us in every way, so that he can make atonement and be merciful and faithful high priest. So we may be getting that out of order a little bit. So fully human in every way. So it sounds like you may be nuancing that.
Yep.
And, in Hebrews 2, maybe that's super fair. The Hebrews 4 is
that's where everybody goes.
We do not have a high priest. What?
I said that's where everybody goes. It's the Hebrew 4 when I say that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And I'm going to add one more. Did you hear I had 3 places?
You did,
I don't know if you know where I'm going next.
I've never read the book of Hebrews. So
we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been, here in NIV is tempted. I prefer tested, in every way as we are, but did not sin. And so those would be the two. And the question is, what does it mean that he's tested in every way? I mean, again, it is a theological point that I refuse to use tempted, because I think in our understanding, the way that we use the word tempted, at least in English, the connotation is that one is tempted when they are lured. Yeah. Like, oh, I'm tempted to eat this chocolate cake that I really shouldn't eat, or whatever, or something much more dubious. So Jesus is tested in every way. And so for me, I think that this points toward something like what we're going to see in Hebrews 5, for example, and there are other places in Hebrews where, first it's that Jesus, like all the other priests or high priests, is taken from humanity and able to deal gently because he is beset with weakness. A lot of students, my students and colleagues for that matter, but mostly my students, they think that this is about the Levitical priests, but it's not. It's every high priest. And so it doesn't, him being beset with weakness that's him being human. And it says the issue that they take, and this is a side note, is that it says that the priest has to make sacrifices for his own sins. Yeah. But I would say that that's theoretically, if a priest sins, he has to offer sacrifices for it. Jesus does not, nevertheless. Then in Hebrews 5:7, this is where he's offering up prayers and fervent cries, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is, people think this is a portrait of Gethsemane. I don't think that's likely. I think it's more likely, as you say, a picture of the incarnation, during which Jesus is consistently tempted. He experiences weakness. He has difficulty. And he consistently cries out to the Father. And so they stay united in that way as well. So, I did write an essay on testing in Hebrews, and in it I say we have no idea if this means that in the specific test that I'm going to have in 20 minutes when I try to convince toddlers to do anything that I want them to do. If Jesus experienced something like that, he certainly didn't experience physically being a mother, but I think he can identify with mothers and fathers and all of that. But physical illness, hunger, weakness, exhaustion, those are general kinds of sins. And so I think it breaks down a little bit. Like, I think there is an extent to which in each of my moments that Jesus is able to empathize with the particular struggle that I experience there, but I don't know how. So that's where Hebrews is not clear. And so I think that's why I would want to press, because I think there is an extent to which Jesus understands every kind of temptation or every experience of or testing, or every experience of testing. But maybe not all in the same way. So I don't know. Maybe that doesn't make any sense, but hopefully it was a little bit coherent. Yeah, no, I think the testing and temptation is a good distinction, because actually I think in that sense, it I don't know if it gives it a new category. I guess it does in some sense, but it even just steps back a little bit and says that it's more than just whether or not Satan was trying to get him to sin. There are other ways to be tested in your humanity. And there are other testings that you will feel just by the fact that you have put on a human flesh and live in a fallen world, right? So I think that's where I want to make a distinction. Particularly, I agree with you. Tempted as we are, tested as we are in every way, so such that he can be sympathetic toward us. But that doesn't entail that he has to have been tempted in every unique way every person has, even more generally, because you and I don't have to have the same experience for me to be sympathetic or even empathetic toward, you losing somebody you love. Well, if we both lost somebody we love, even if it's somebody who's closer or further from us, there's a sense in which I can sympathize with you, even if I don't feel the same pain or whatever. Right. So there are some kind of general ways you can talk about that. I think that could be related there. I think where I just keep feeling like impeccability is such a helpful doctrine that I think we need to hold on to is that this is still one person who is both God and man, right? So if we're not careful, we emphasize all the humanity and forget that this is God who has put on flesh. So in fact, the fathers will oftentimes, in some sense, privilege the divinity actually,
and say he is the one who has put on flesh. So he is maybe not primarily God, because they want to obviously hold the hypostatic union, but there's a sense in which that it is the person of the Son who has put on flesh, right? So you have these two natures in one person. So I think that's where I still am like, okay, but I don't want to go so humanity heavy that I've now lost the fact that this is the perfect, sinless, divine Son who has done this. And so I think that's where impeccability is helpful, and where I want to say, I think we can make some distinction between his will or his sort of internal relations. Again, we don't know everything. Like, we don't know what he was thinking at all times, but I can imagine that there's a clear distinction between a man who is not fallen, not sinful, and is God, obviously, and who is coming to be the true humanity, that there have to be some very clear distinctions between us and him. Because, and I think that's where I want to say, I have a hard time with the idea that Jesus is just always internally wrestling with falling into sin. You can struggle with weakness, frustration, tired, even in some sense, maybe wrestle with temptation to sin in some sense. I mean, Hebrews 5:8, right after what you were quoting, does say that he was the son who learned obedience, right? So there's a sense in which he didn't just come out of the womb obedient per se,